Kamikaze, divine wind or spirit wind, officially Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, abbreviated as Tokkō Tai, and used as a verb as Tokkō, were suicide attacks by military aviators from the Empire of Japan against Allied naval vessels in the closing stages of the Pacific Campaign of World War II, designed to destroy warships more effectively than was possible with conventional attacks. During World War II, about 3,860 kamikaze pilots died, and about 19% of kamikaze attacks managed to hit a ship. Kamikaze aircraft were essentially pilot-guided explosive missiles, purpose-built or converted from conventional aircraft. Pilots would attempt to crash their aircraft into enemy ships in what was called a body attack, in planes laden with some combination of explosives, bombs, torpedoes and full fuel tanks. Accuracy was much better than a conventional attack, the payload and explosion larger. A kamikaze could sustain damage which would disable a conventional attacker and still achieve its objective, the goal of crippling or destroying large numbers of Allied ships, particularly aircraft carriers, was considered by the Empire of Japan to be a just reason for sacrificing pilots and aircraft. These attacks, which began in October 1944, followed several critical military defeats for the Japanese. They had long since lost aerial dominance due to outdated aircraft and the loss of experienced pilots. On a macroeconomic scale, Japan suffered from a diminishing capacity for war, and a rapidly declining industrial capacity relative to the Allies. Despite these problems, the Japanese government expressed its reluctance to surrender. In combination, these factors led to the use of kamikaze tactics as Allied forces advanced towards the Japanese home islands. While the term kamikaze usually refers to the aerial strikes, it has also been applied to various other suicide attacks. The Japanese military also used or made plans for non-aerial Japanese special attack units, including those involving submarines, human torpedoes, speedboats and divers. The tradition of death instead of defeat, capture, and perceived shame was deeply entrenched in Japanese military culture. It was one of the primary traditions in the samurai life and the Bushido code, loyalty and honor until death, as the Japanese perceived it. Definition and etymology. The Japanese word kamikaze is usually translated as divine wind. The word originated from Maku-raku Toba of waka poetry modifying eyes, and has been used since August of 1281 to refer to the major typhoons which dispersed Mongolian invasion fleets under Kublai Khan in 1274. In Japanese, the formal term used for units carrying out suicide attacks during 1944–1945 is Tokubetsu Kōgekitai, which literally means special attack unit. This is usually abbreviated to Tokkō Tai. More specifically, air suicide attack units from the Imperial Japanese Navy were officially called Shinpu Tokubetsu Kōgekitai. Shinpu is the on-reading of the same characters that formed the word kamikaze in Japanese. During World War II, the pronunciation kamikaze was used in Japan only informally in relation to suicide attacks. But after the war, this usage gained acceptance worldwide and was re-imported into Japan. As a result, the special attack units are sometimes known in Japan as kamikaze Tokubetsu Kōgekitai. History. Background. Before the formation of kamikaze units, pilots had made deliberate crashes as a last resort when the planes had suffered severe damage and they did not want to risk being captured, or wanted to do as much damage to the enemy as possible. Since they were crashing anyway, such situations occurred in both the Axis and Allied air forces. Axel and K see these suicides as individual, impromptu decisions by men who were mentally prepared to die. The case of Nikolai Gastela's Taran on the 26th of June 1941 passed into Soviet air warfare law. In most cases, little evidence exists that such hits represented more than accidental collisions of the kind that sometimes happen in intense sea or air battles. One example of this occurred on the 7th of December 1941 during the attack on Pearl Harbor. First Lieutenant Fusita Iida's plane had taken a hit and had started leaking fuel when he apparently used it to make a suicide attack on Kanyohi Naval Air Station. Before taking off, he had told his men that if his plane were to become badly damaged, he would crash it into a worthy enemy target. The carrier battles in 1942, particularly Midway, inflicted irreparable damage on the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, such that they could no longer put together a large number of fleet carriers with well-trained aircrews. Japanese planners had assumed a quick war and lacked comprehensive programs to replace the losses of ships, pilots, and sailors. At Midway in June 1942, the Japanese lost as many aircrewmen in a single day as the pre-war training program had produced in a year. The following Solomon Islands campaign and the New Guinea campaign, notably the battles of Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, further decimated the IJNAS veteran aircrews, and replacing the combat experience proved impossible. During 1943–1944, U.S. forces steadily advanced toward Japan. Newer U.S.-made planes, especially the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair, began to outnumber and outclass Japan's fighter planes. Tropical diseases, as well as shortages of spare parts and fuel, made operations more and more difficult for the IJNAS. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Japanese had to make do with obsolete aircraft and inexperienced aviators in the fight against better trained and more experienced U.S. Navy airmen who flew radar-directed combat air patrols. The Japanese lost over 400 carrier-based planes and pilots in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, effectively putting an end to the carrier's potency. Allied aviators called the action the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, planes from the carrier Chiyoda approached a U.S. task group. According to some accounts, two made suicide attacks, one of which hit us, Indiana. The important Japanese base of Saipan fell to the Allied forces on the 15th of July 1944. Its capture provided adequate forward bases which enabled U.S. Air Forces using the Boeing B-29 Superfortress to strike at the Japanese home islands. After the fall of Saipan, the Japanese High Command predicted that the Allies would try to capture the Philippines, strategically important to Tokyo because of the location between the oil fields of Southeast Asia and Japan. Beginnings. Captain Motoharu Okamura, in charge of the Tateyama base in Tokyo, as well as the 341st Air Group Home, was, according to some sources, the first officer to officially propose kamikaze attack tactics. He arranged with his superiors the first investigations on the plausibility and mechanisms of intentional suicide attacks on the 15th of June 1944. In August 1944, it was announced by the domain news agency that a flight instructor named Takeo Tagata was training pilots in Taiwan for suicide missions. One source claims that the first kamikaze mission occurred on the 13th of September 1944. A group of pilots from the Army's 31st Fighter Squadron on Negros Island decided to launch a suicide attack the following morning. First Lieutenant Takeshi Kosai and a sergeant were selected. Two 100 kg bombs were attached to two fighters, and the pilots took off before dawn, planning to crash into carriers. They never returned, but there is no record of an enemy plane hitting an Allied ship that day. According to some sources, on the 14th of October 1944, Reno was hit by a deliberately crashed Japanese plane. Rear Admiral Masafuma Arima, the commander of the 26th Air Flotilla, is sometimes credited with inventing the kamikaze tactic. Arima personally led an attack by about 100 Yokosuka D-4Y Suesei dive bombers against a large Essex-class aircraft carrier Franklin, near Leyte Gulf, on the 15th of October 1944. Arima was killed and part of a plane hit Franklin. The Japanese high command and propagandists seized on Arima's example. He was promoted posthumously to admiral and was given official credit for making the first kamikaze attack. However, it is not clear that this was a planned suicide attack, and official Japanese accounts of Arima's attack bore little resemblance to the actual events. On the 17th of October 1944, Allied forces assaulted Suluan Island, beginning the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 1st Air Fleet, based at Manila, was assigned the task of assisting the Japanese ships which would attempt to destroy Allied forces in Leyte Gulf. However, the 1st Air Fleet at the time only had 40 aircraft, 34 Mitsubishi A6M0 carrier-based fighters, 3 Nakajima B6N Tenzin torpedo bombers, 1 Mitsubishi G4M and 2 Yokosuka P1Y Ginger land-based bombers, and 1 additional reconnaissance aircraft. The task facing the Japanese air forces seemed impossible. The 1st Air Fleet Commandant, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, decided to form a suicide offensive force, the Special Attack Unit. In a meeting at Mabalikade Airfield near Manila, on the 19th of October, Onishi told officers of the 201st Flying Group headquarters, "I don't think there would be any other certain way to carry out the operation than to put a 250 kilograms bomb on a Zero and let it crash into a U.S. carrier in order to disable her for a week." 1st Unit Commander Asaki Tamei asked a group of 23 talented student pilots, all of whom he had trained, to volunteer for the Special Attack Force. All of the pilots raised both of the hands, volunteering to join the operation. Later, Tamei asked Lieutenant Yukio Seki to command the Special Attack Force. Seki is said to have closed his eyes, lowered his head and thought for 10 seconds, before saying, "Please do appoint me to the post." Seki became the 24th kamikaze pilot to be chosen. However, Seki later said, "Japan's future is bleak if it is forced to kill one of its best pilots. And I'm not going on this mission for the Emperor, for the Empire. I'm going because I was ordered to." The names of 4 subunits within the Kamikaze Special Attack Force were Unit Shikishima, Unit Yamato, Unit Asahi, and Unit Yamazakura. These names were taken from a patriotic death poem, Shikishima no Yamato Gokoro wa Hitoto ba, Asahi ni Anayo yu Yamazakura bana, by the Japanese classical scholar Motori Norinaga. The poem reads, "If someone asks about the Yamato spirit of Shikishima, it is the flowers of Yamazakura that are fragrant in the Asahi." A less literal translation is, "Asked about the soul of Japan, I would say that it is like wild cherry blossoms glowing in the morning sun." Onishi, addressing this unit, told them that the nobility of spirit would keep the homeland from ruin even in defeat. Leyte Gulf. The first attacks. Several suicide attacks, carried out during the invasion of Leyte, by Japanese pilots from units other than the Special Attack Force, have been described as the first kamikaze attack. Early on the 21st of October, a Japanese aircraft, possibly a Navy HD-3A dive bomber or an Army Mitsubishi Ki-51, deliberately crashed into the foremast of the heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. The attack killed 30 personnel, including the cruiser's captain Emile Deschanel, and wounded 64, including the Australian Force commander, Commodore John Collins. The Australian official history of the war claimed that this was the first kamikaze attack on an Allied ship, although other sources disagree because it was not a planned attack by a member of the Special Attack Force, but was most likely to have been undertaken on the pilot's own initiative. The sinking of the ocean tug Sonoma on the 24th of October is listed in some sources as the first ship lost to a kamikaze strike, but the attack occurred before the 25th of October, and the aircraft used, a Mitsubishi G4M, was not flown by the original 4 Special Attack Squadrons. On the 25th of October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Kamikaze Special Attack Force carried out its first mission. 5 A6M0s, led by Seki, and escorted to the target by leading Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, attacked several escort carriers. 1-0 attempted to hit the bridge of Uskakon Bay but instead exploded on the port catwalk and cartwheeled into the sea. 2 others dived at Fanshawe Bay but were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. The last 2 ran at White Plains. 1, under heavy fire and trailing smoke, aborted the attempt on White Plains and instead banked toward St. Lo, plowing into the flight deck. Its bomb caused fires that resulted in the bomb magazine exploding, sinking the carrier. By day's end on the 26th of October, 55 kamikazes from the Special Attack Force had also damaged the large escort carriers Sangamon, Suwannee, which had also been struck by a kamikaze at 8:04 forward of its aft elevator on the 25th of October, Santee, and the smaller escorts White Plains, Gleelan Bay, and Kitcon Bay. In total, 7 carriers were hit, as well as 40 other ships. Main wave of attacks. Early successes, such as the sinking of St. Lo, were followed by an immediate expansion of the program, and over the next few months over 2,000 planes made such attacks. When Japan began to be subject to intense strategic bombing by Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, the Japanese military attempted to use suicide attacks against this threat. During the Northern Hemisphere winter of 1944–45, the IJAAF formed the 47th Air Regiment, also known as the Shinton Special Unit at Narimasu Airfield, Nerima, Tokyo, to defend the Tokyo metropolitan area. The unit was equipped with Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki fighters, with which they were to ram United States Army Air Force's B-29s in their attacks on Japan. However, this proved much less successful and practical since an airplane is a much faster, more maneuverable, and smaller target than a warship. The B-29 also had formidable defensive weaponry, so suicide attacks against the plane demanded considerable piloting skill to be successful, which worked against the very purpose of using expendable pilots. Even encouraging capable pilots to bail out before impact was ineffective because vital personnel were often lost when they mistimed their exits and were killed as a result. On the 11th of March, the U.S. carrier Randolph was hit and moderately damaged at Uluru Atoll, in the Caroline Islands, by a kamikaze that had flown almost 4,000 kilometers from Japan in a mission called Operation Tanno. 2. On the 20th of March, the submarine Devilfish survived a hit from an aircraft just off Japan. Purpose-built kamikaze planes, as opposed to converted fighters and dive bombers, were also being constructed. Ensign Mitsuo Ohta had suggested that piloted glider bombs, carried within range of targets by a mother plane, should be developed. The first Naval Air Technical Bureau in Yokosuka refined Ohta's idea. Yokosuka MXY-7OK rocket planes, launched from bombers, were first deployed in kamikaze attacks from March 1945. U.S. personnel gave them the derisive nickname Bakabombs. The Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi was a simple, easily built propeller aircraft with a wooden airframe which used engines from existing stocks. Its non-retractable landing gear was jettisoned shortly after takeoff for a suicide mission and reused. During 1945, the Japanese military began stockpiling hundreds of Tsurugi, other aircraft, OKs, and suicide boats, for use against Allied forces expected to invade Japan. The invasion never happened, and few were ever used. Allied defensive tactics. In early 1945, U.S. Navy aviator Commander John Thatch, already famous for developing effective aerial tactics against the Japanese such as the Thatch Weave, developed a defensive strategy against kamikazes called the Big Blue Blanket to establish Allied air supremacy well away from the carrier force. This recommended combat air patrols which were larger and operated further from the carriers than before. A line of picket destroyers and destroyer escorts at least 80 kilometers from the main body of the fleet to provide earlier radar interception, and improved coordination between fighter direction officers on carriers. This plan also called for around-the-clock fighter patrols over Allied fleets, though the U.S. Navy had cut back training of fighter pilots so there were not enough Navy pilots available to counter the kamikaze threat. A final element included intensive fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields and bombing of Japanese runways, using delayed action bombs to make repairs more difficult. Late in 1944, the British Pacific Fleet used the good high-altitude performance of the Supermarine Seafires on combat air patrol duties. Seafires were heavily involved in countering the kamikaze attacks during the Iwo Jima landings and beyond. The Seafire's best day was the 15th of August 1945, shooting down 8 attacking aircraft for a single loss. Allied pilots were experienced and better trained, and flew superior aircraft, making the poorly trained kamikaze pilots easy targets. The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force alone could bring over 1,000 fighter aircraft into play. Allied pilots became adept at destroying enemy aircraft before they struck ships. Allied gunners had begun to develop techniques to negate kamikaze attacks. Light rapid-fire anti-aircraft weapons such as the 40mm Bofors and 20mm Helicon autocannons were highly effective, but heavy anti-aircraft guns such as the 5.38 caliber gun had the punch to blow kamikazes out of the air, which was preferable since even a heavily damaged kamikaze could complete its mission. The O-case with the high speed presented a very difficult problem for anti-aircraft fire, since the velocity made fire control extremely difficult. By 1945, large numbers of anti-aircraft shells with radio frequency proximity fuses, on average 7 times more effective than regular shells, became available, and the USN recommended their use against kamikaze attacks. Final phase. The peak in kamikaze attacks came during the period of April to June 1945, at the Battle of Okinawa. On the 6th of April 1945, waves of aircraft made hundreds of of attacks in Operation Kikasui. At Okinawa, kamikaze attacks focused at first on Allied destroyers on picket duty and then on the carriers in the middle of the fleet. Suicide attacks by planes or boats at Okinawa sank or put out of action at least 30 U.S. warships, and at least 3 U.S. merchant ships, along with some from other Allied forces. The attacks expended 1,465 planes. Many warships of all classes were damaged, some severely, but no aircraft carriers, battleships or cruisers were sunk by kamikaze at Okinawa. Most of the ships lost were destroyers or smaller vessels, especially those on picket duty. The destroyer Uslafi earned the nickname, the ship that would not die, after surviving 6 kamikaze attacks and 4 bomb hits during this battle. So many destroyers were attacked that one ship's crew, considering the aircraft carriers to be more important targets, erected a large sign with an arrow which read, "That way to the carriers." U.S. carriers with the wooden flight decks appeared to suffer more damage from kamikaze hits than the reinforced steel-decked carriers from the British Pacific Fleet. U.S. carriers also suffered considerably heavier casualties from kamikaze strikes. For instance, 389 men were killed in one attack on Bunker Hill, greater than the combined number of fatalities suffered on all 6 Royal Navy armored carriers from all forms of attack during the entire war. 8 kamikaze hits on 5 British carriers resulted in only 20 deaths, while a combined total of 15 bomb hits, most of 500 kilograms weight or greater, and 1 torpedo hit on 4 carriers caused 193 fatal casualties earlier in the war, striking proof of the protective value of the armored flight deck. The resilience of well-armored vessels was shown on the 4th of May, just after 11:30, when there was a wave of suicide attacks against the British Pacific Fleet. One Japanese plane made a steep dive from a great height at the carrier HMS Formidable and was engaged by AA guns. Although it was hit by gunfire, a bomb from the kamikaze detonated on the flight deck, making a crater 3 meters long, 0.6 meters wide and 0.6 meters deep. A long steel splinter speared down through the hangar deck and the main boiler room, before coming to rest in a fuel tank near the aircraft park, where it started a major fire. 8 personnel were killed and 47 were wounded. 1 Corsair and 10 Grumman Avengers were destroyed. However, the fires were gradually brought under control, and the crater in the deck was repaired with concrete and steel plate. By 1700, Corsairs were able to land. On the 9th of May, Formidable was again damaged by kamikaze, as were the carrier HMS Victorious and a battleship HMS Howe. The British were able to clear the flight deck and resume flight operations in just hours, while their American counterparts took a few days or even months, as observed by a USN liaison officer on HMS Indefatigable, who commented, "When a kamikaze hits a U.S. carrier it means 6 months of repair at Pearl. When a kamikaze hits a Limey carrier it's just a case of sweepers, manual brooms." Sometimes twin-engined aircraft were used in planned kamikaze attacks. For example, Mitsubishi Ki-67 Hiryu medium bombers based on Formosa undertook kamikaze attacks on Allied forces off Okinawa. Rear Admiral Matomu Gaki, the second-in-command of the combined Pacific Fleet, directed the last official kamikaze attack, sending Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei or Judies from the 701st Air Group against the Allied fleet at Okinawa on the 15th of August 1945.